It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to focus on the new piece here in Sydney that you have the opportunity to see in person and tell you a little bit more in depth about how it came to be. Let's see. You heard a little bit about my being asked to represent the connection of countries in the Western Hemisphere. I got an email from the curator here at the Powerhouse asking if I might send something here to the Southern Hemisphere. And I started thinking about that physical event that started in Chile, and I had not been focusing on the fact that those ripples across the Pacific Ocean washed up against the beaches here in Sydney. And it seemed like this was really the most natural place for this idea to travel across the ocean. When I first encountered this article about a scientist from NASA, the space entity from the United States, had measured the change in the Earth's mass, he was able to measure the fact that the Earth's rotation had sped up by this very, very tiny amount, 1.26 microseconds. And I didn't fully understand what that meant, and I started thinking about figure skaters. When they pull their arms in and they twist faster. And that's what happened to the Earth. And before that, really I thought time was the one thing that you could count on, would never change. That's the, taxes and death, or, and the thought that an event, a physical event in one part of the world could not only affect me in another part of the world, but actually change time as I measured it, or as we as a culture measured it, was really the idea that engaged me, that I wanted to really deal with. And this is that original map. This is what we developed in my studio using a software to take that data and give it three-dimensional shape. So these are the wave heights across the Pacific Ocean. So it's through time, these are the maximum wave heights. And this is what it looks like. And here's a detail. So that pattern that you see is actually just caused by the fact that the two-digit numbers are darker than one-digit numbers. So the darkened pattern, they're over 10. And this is how, in my studio, we began to sort of hone in on a shape. It's not data visualization. I think of them as sort of loosely inspired by scientific data. And really, for me, it's just a handle. It's like a way in for a deeper kind of experience, or it's a way in. Everybody needs a different kind of entry, and this is one additional layer. And this is some of how we build them in this software that we've developed, where we create each band of netting, and then I stretch them, and then we exert the force of gravity on them. And then we start measuring the city. It's like making a custom garment, maybe a custom suit. So we picked a place in the city where it was originally invited and started making these measurements about how that might fit over the street. And the color palette referring to this scientific mapping color. And because I was a painter, for the first decade of my professional life as an artist, I still think of color as something that I mix, like the same way I used to mix colors with a palette knife. I now mix different fibers, and these are the different combinations. You can see the percentages. And I'm working, Jan talked about my interest in craft. I'm really interested in industrial craft. More than decorative forms, because they come out of necessity. A fisherman doesn't make his net a certain way because it's more beautiful. It can become beautiful, but it comes out of necessity. And that the interest of working with industry and industrial workers and finding the hidden potential and craftsmanship in that work is really something that I don't lose interest in year after year. I'm still interested in tapping deeper and deeper into that and in looking into other parts of life. So here's the working with Everson Cordage, and the guy who's worked there for 20 years. We have these conversations about denier of fiber and, you know, which braiding machine, is it the 12 bobbin or the, you know, like the real specificity and experience of all those years of working with a machine. And then I work with a commercial fishing net factory that's up the street, and they're brother-in-laws. So there's really good communication, and they know which kind of bobbin it has to be spun on depending on which of the industrial netting machines. And some of this technology is almost 100 years old. Is that about right, David? I mean, so, you know, there are digital netting machines, but this is truly like industrial era. It's not the digital era, really. So I'm working with technology that is ancient. I mean, the making of nets and fishing is, I think indigenous people here were using nets many thousands of years ago. And then there's this industrial era technology, and then there's this truly new digital computer software that we use for both the engineering and the modeling. So there's also a lot of handwork. In the upper, your right-hand corner is when our software really couldn't figure stuff out for us. This was really too complex for the brain of our software. We then went back to hand making, and that's a hand-knitted model. And we started doing scale models, and we rigged it up from the ceiling in my studio, and we put push pins around the edge. We cut it out of foam core, lined it with push pins, and we took the regular net and then we started adjusting it by hand. So it's both digital technology, and then we go back to good old-fashioned trial and error physical prototyping. And here's some of the measurements. And sketching, and watercolor. And there's the first installation of the project in Denver, and the discovery of the shadow making as a method of drawing in the city and engaging the city. Now in Denver, we didn't have an entire palette that we have here in Sydney. Thanks to the work of the Powerhouse Museum in the city of Sydney, we have an incredible lighting palette that I am now, for the first time, able, this was part of my original design, but we didn't have the budgetary resources to do that in Denver. So for the first time, the piece will be fully realized with its changing lighting program. So that, for me, is incredibly satisfying. As we stood out there last night on George Street testing the different colors, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So here are some details, but you'll get to see the real thing, I hope, here in the middle of your city. This is in Denver. It was attached, literally laced into the facade of their art museum. This is designed by the Italian architect Gio Ponti, next to the Liebeskind wing, which was just opened. And there it is. So when we got this invitation from Sydney, and I started looking and analyzing what did this mean as I took this project for the first time of any of my projects to the Southern Hemisphere, and we started looking at the time it took for that tsunami wave to go from Chile to the beaches here in Sydney, and it was 15 hours. And that becomes part of the lighting program. These are tests of lighting colors, and that, as you go out on the street, and if you take the time to wait and let the piece unfold, you will sense that rhythm of the time this event happened in Chile, and it rippled, and its effects were felt here in Sydney. I think the work that I make actually is a very hybrid form, because it has references to the history of fine art production. I mean, I think about and study classical art, and I'm looking at Roman painting, and I'm, you know, so I am grounded as an artist, and I do think in terms of the frame of the history of art making as a cultural production. And I'm in dialogue with that history. But my work in the world is truly a hybrid of urban design, it's temporary architecture, it's shaping of space, it involves sociology. I mean, you can look at it, and then of course there are the technological aspects of it. So I think the actual production is truly hybrid, and that's what's interesting about it, is that it's really reaching into the city, and it's reaching out of traditional boundaries of art viewing. I mean, it's certainly not within the white walls of a box of the gallery. You know, I will share a story about that.
I'm feeling like I'm standing here as the guard between you and everyone. But if you can forget that, go for it.
Well, the first time I was asked to do a solo exhibition in New York City, I was a young painter, and I had just discovered sculpture. And I got invited to do this first show, and you know, it's like every artist's dream, a show in New York. And I got to the gallery in Chelsea, and I was completely stuck. I couldn't think of anything I wanted to do in the gallery space. And I realized that everything I did went outside the windows. So there was one line of windows on the street, on 29th Street, and then the other line went into the courtyard of the building. And all the work happened outside of the gallery, sort of transgressing the public space. So it's called Red Cones on 29th Street. And so the only thing you see in the gallery is the projection of red light through the work onto the floor of the gallery. And so it was like a lesson to me. It's like, well, that is your space, so just embrace it. You know, I am an artist of the street. It's a different kind of street artist. And I think I came, you know, I'm at peace with that. You know, it's like, that's where I belong. And here, I want to credit Peter Morton, who, you know, this is such a collaborative process. There's no question that I could never do this work alone. And you may not even realize how many people have played a really critical role. But Peter, who were you with when you were out looking for sites?
I was with the project manager, Joan Del Soppo, and the curator.
You and Lindy,
And Lindy Wall.
So they're out walking in the city, and they, maybe you should tell it.
Tell the story, Peter.
Well, we're
a question here that's coming from Sarah Rhodes about how important is it to have trusting clients, of which such you are. And it leads to the complexity of what a client is, but your story may bring that to life. And we are looking for questions from you, so put your hand up and we'll race around and give you the mic, and I'll try to keep my eye open for you. Go, Peter.
Yeah, well, we were actually going to a meeting with the city to explore opportunities for sites, and we came out of the monorail station and crossed that intersection on Georgian Park, and the movement of people and the kind of opportunity for that to be a really dynamic space and its scale suddenly captured our imagination. And we went to the meeting and said to the City of Sydney, we think we've found the space. We think it's here. And immediately they recognised it. And I guess we'd in our mind been thinking about big public space in Sydney and what it represented, and it was about appropriateness. And would you put it in Martin Place? We didn't think so. What other big symbolic spaces were there that you'd use? Was Circular Quay right? No, we didn't think that was right. So it was one of those, I guess, moments where the intersect of people and movement seemed right too, for the work that embraced movement in the way that it does.
So that is such a critical part of what the piece here is about. Its site, its relationship with the site, the flow of people on the street. That's all part of this work, and that part wasn't mine. You know, so it's this really collaborative process. I think of it like a team sport.
Now we've got questions. I know there were hands up. So the microphone is where? Go. And please just say who you are. That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Nina. I've actually been lucky enough to work with Peter on a project in the city, and so he alerted me to the fact that we were actually getting to meet, which is really exciting. I'm a landscape architect, and we are fascinated by the way you change urban space with your artworks. And something that I've been fascinated in watching your work for the last, only the last couple of months actually, is to know whether or not, and you actually mentioned something really quickly, which is that you knitted one of your examples. And I'm fascinated to know if you started with a base of craft work, if you actually were interested in craft work before you started doing on such a massive scale. So like, I guess I've grown up doing crazy stuff like knitting and embroidery and handiwork, and used to do artworks based on women's handiwork and the way it gets displayed and how it gets rethought in this time frame. So I was just interested to know if you had a similar kind of background or something.
I use the sewing machine as a way to draw. I'm a very, I'm not a good fine craftsperson. I would never hire myself. I wouldn't be neat enough. That's not my talent. When I sew, the lines are jagged and it bumps up and it's all three-dimensional, and that's more my way. But any method that enables me to flesh out, they're just all ways of drawing, really. It's just drawing in three-dimensional space. It's a way to discover an idea by making it physical.
Let's take another question from the audience.
Actually,
go for it, sir.
I will answer to the my mom was teaching macrame when I was a kid. And I was 6 years old and I was her assistant. So, and I remember the boards, she had these, that were taped cardboard boards with the T-pins, so it was the 70s, Everyone was doing macrame. So, it all goes back somehow, doesn't it?
Go for it.
Hi, my name's David O'Brien. Travelling along Parramatta Road this morning, there was a reflection that our ugliest urban spaces are completely lacking in nature or any sense of art that exists for its own sake. Which leads to my question. I wonder to what extent you are potentially or are inspired by nature, by the spider web, the patterns on leaves, etc.
Very much so. Peter will tell you when he asked, there's certain things that you want to see here in Sydney. One of the first things I asked was, could I have a tour of the botanical gardens so I could understand how the plant forms have developed differently here on this continent as they were separated from the other parts of the landmass. I'm very interested in college I studied, I took a course in evolutionary biology by Stephen Jay Gould. And I became fascinated with the Precambrian life forms that came into being and all died away so many millions of years ago, that they didn't have the advancement of multicellular life, so they were only one cell thick. They had to take in and excrete all within this one layer. So it was all about design innovation within the constraint of being flat. So it's all surface area. And in a way, that's where all my original works, I was thinking about that. It's like designing life form. You have a constraint. And when a fisherman makes a net, he also has certain constraint. And within that, that enabled creative expression or creative discovery is maybe more the right term.
The other interesting thing, though, about nature, I felt the other night when the work came out of its box, was that the Spectra fibre, which the riggers and engineers were showing me, he was telling me it's actually been inspired by the spider's web. That the pattern, because it's 15 times stronger than steel bubble, the intense pattern in it is actually modelled from spider's webs. So that it's got another link with nature, which is very interesting.
And when I talk about how the methods that have been honed over centuries have this kind of essential beauty, because anything not needed would have been lost or given, you know, washed away in the years. I mean, in nature, certainly anything that is not useful, that animal or life form really doesn't survive. So there's this kind of test of time in both nature and in culture.
Does your success inhibit your projects?
I'm going to pass that to David.
Now, David is a real collaborator with Janet, so this is a really interesting insight into the teamwork here and what role you play.
Well, I think it's an issue that's actually hard to avoid. It's one you never think of if you haven't had some acclaim for something you do. But if you think about certain artists who might have had a very broad set of work that they've done. I mean, Jackson Pollock. I mean, you don't want a Jackson Pollock that's not the Jackson Pollock you know. He did a whole lot of other stuff, or the buildings Frank Gehry does. There's some brilliant buildings he did that don't look like a Frank Gehry building. And you never think about that until all of a sudden you have an iconic style, and then people are like, oh yeah, I want an Echelman. And they have an idea of what that means. And I give Janet huge props for going down to Philadelphia and being invited by a very high profile project to redo the plaza in front of City Hall that was this disastrous 1970s concrete wasteland, and they're going to rip the whole thing out and replace it. And Janet looked at the site and said, I don't think this site needs a net. I mean, and they clearly invited Janet because they'd seen all of her big net works, and they thought maybe one would fit here, and she came down and said, no, that's the wrong material here, and went off in search of another material, which was one of these wonderfully tortuous paths that Janet takes, where you know, she ends up working with some pool equipment fountain pump designer and said, hey, can we tweak this stuff? And they're like, whatever, lady. And then pretty soon she's excited about it, and she says, wait, no, this is it. And I was like, what's it? She said, we're going to take this reorganized fountain equipment that we've changed the way the water comes out so that the water droplets are so small that they both block light, so you could project light against them, but you put your hand in it and not get wet. We're going to put them across the plaza and reference the fact that this was the organization, the original location of steam power in America, downtown Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Railroad. And I mean, I give Janet huge props for getting to that point creatively, but also to the team in Philadelphia for saying, okay, let's go with this.
For taking the risk. For
taking the risk, which is central to an artist who works in public space, is that it's not like it's your canvas and you just do what you like. There are many constituencies in all of these projects and many constraints that need to be worked through. And so I think it is a daunting problem to have an iconic style. It's kind of wonderful. And I think that if you look at the morphology of Janet's net pieces, they actually are changing quite a bit from piece to piece. I think there's a lot more creative space to explore there, but it's also nice to be able to branch out and take a risk on a new form. I hope Philly works out really well.
In a way, that answers your question that was posed earlier about what makes a good client.
Yes.
Like the way to avoid being limited by some successes is to have clients who are willing to let you take risks. And I mean, the one thing I will share is it doesn't get easier. I mean, you'd think, well, okay, she knows how to do this. But every project, I mean, it's torture. I mean, I don't know what to do. It's not like, it just comes. It's like, it's hard work. And there are a lot of bad ideas that come before the good ones come. Everybody thinks, oh, artists, they just get those ideas. But really, it's just, it's about, plugging away, day after day, because they slowly reveal themselves. They don't just come in a dream all hatched. I will quote Picasso, who said, when inspiration finds me, she will find me at work.
Which is what the next tweet is actually about. Put your hand up and we'll get to you with a microphone so you can ask a question from the audience. But Katrina Pollard has written, what types of things or activities do you do to further develop your creativity? Can you give that one a go, Janet?
Learning. I think I'm a learning junkie. Last year I got up and went to class 2 days a week at 8 in the morning to study the history of Roman architecture. You know, it's not because I don't know about the history of architecture, and I'm working in cities, and I want to understand what a lintel means. Like, you know, what's the language of our cities? And when I want to learn. I was asking about the there's this genus of plants that I saw that. Yes, Araucariaceae. I like all the different pronunciations of that. You know, and I asked, well, what makes those different from conifers? And like that could become a whole piece to understand how nature, why it created this different form, why the gum cap, the gum nut is shaped like this and that, and you know, like this is really interesting. And the good news is there's no end to what I can learn, so that's what keeps it fresh for me. And when I'm not learning, I find I kind of get into a bit of a funk. And so that's the solution for me to stay fresh as an artist. And I think that is the challenge. I mean, I have no interest to repeat myself. And so if each piece has to reveal itself, I won't take a project if it doesn't enable me to push my work in some new way. And so having become clear about that, it makes the whole process much simpler.
Here we go. Over here's a question, and then I've got a lovely question from a tweeter.
Okay.
Actually, I think you just answered my question. My name is Jenny Turpin. I'm an artist in the public domain as well. And thank you for your very inspiring presentation and your work. My question is simply, has there ever been a project invitation that you've refused?
Sure. Sure.
And for different reasons, or?
Mostly, the main criteria is if I don't think I'll be able to do my best work. And there could be many reasons for that. It could be, as you can imagine, working in the public sphere, there are all kinds of reasons. And there are projects that I drew a line where I was ready to walk away. And in the end, I was able to continue because at least I was clear. I to myself. It was like, and it was an integrated piece where there were architects and there were, you know.
Tell the story of the San Francisco report.
Well, I'll tell one moment in that where I was given a site which was a very long corridor in the roof of an area that they asked to become the zone of recomposure right after you leave security. And I designed this work that spanned this, that you would experience as you moved through this long hall.
Oh, and in the context of Janet's work, remember, it's indoors.
Yeah.
So
it was my first indoor project.
Ever done was outdoors, and the airport comes along, and so we have a pretty big hall. And for halls, it was pretty big, except compared to the outdoor spaces Janet had previously built in it, actually not so big.
Well, and then I said I want to cut these shapes through the ceiling to let natural light in. And they said, okay, as long as you work with the beams. And here are the beams. And
that's not what they said first.
Okay. But the point where I felt like this was almost the end for me was they said, oh, we forgot to tell you. I know you've designed the whole thing now. We forgot to tell you there are 2 rows of pendant lights that go down the center. And I said, what? And they said, oh, but I see there's a hole in the middle of your sculptures. Why can't we just have the light? Can't we just move your sculpture and have the light go down the center? And I thought, you know what? Maybe this is one of those projects where you just, you call it, we can both mutually agree to not continue. And in the end, I hired a lighting designer, my own lighting designer, and from my art budget paid to redesign all the lighting of the entire hall so that I could then proceed in a way that I felt could enable the work to do what it was meant to do.
So it did go ahead?
It did go ahead, but it was good to be clear.
Yeah.
And I think compromise is a really important thing for an artist who works in the public realm. And I think the key is to be able to determine which compromises are central to the idea and are not. And then when it's not central to the artistic idea, then it's really important to make compromises where you can. You got to be a team player. But then when I say, but this is something I cannot compromise on, people respect that. And so I think that's also something I've learned, and that probably relates to many fields.
My name is Elizabeth, and I'm a textile engineer. And you did say a little bit about it, but I wondered how you went from seeing the fishing net into what we see here and into your work. I mean, what was the process?
That's a big question.
It's a big question. Even from the early work, you saw wide hips, and you saw the work in Lithuania with the lace. When I was asked to do the piece in Portugal, I had never done anything at that scale and nothing permanent. That they took the risk in commissioning me is astonishing. And that I said yes, despite the fact that I didn't know how to do it. I just believed I could figure it out. And there are so many steps, but if you take each one and just break it apart, and then as David has taught me, if you think there's a barrier, then rethink it and realize there might be another way around, and just to really, you know, if you address each barrier with seriousness without giving up, it's only a question of time.
I also think it's worth noting that from Janet's earliest work in Bali, she had collaborated with hand craftspeople, so batik masters and the river fishermen and some temple sculptors in India and the lace makers in Lithuania. And one of the huge discoveries that continues to be a source of real joy for Janet is that she didn't realize that when you moved into the industrial and engineered realm, there's just as much of a craft there. That it doesn't have to be something you do with your hand. It can be something you do with a computer and a machine, but there's still this deep craft where the guy looks at you and says, "No, I don't do it like that." And there's intuition, and there's craft, and there's working within the constraints of your medium that's just as rewarding in an industrial realm, because now you're building public art that sits over roadways, and someone says, you know, can we get an engineer stamp on this that it's not going to fall over, you know, or blow off in the wind or get stuck on something, and to be able to solve all those problems in a very craft-like way turns out to be rewarding, and I think is why Janet's been on this trajectory of really embracing permanent engineered public work that's made of soft materials, because the craft element is as prominent as ever.
And now I know why it hasn't been done. Because it's really hard.
It really is fabulous to have you here with us tonight, Janet. I mean, it just goes to show that dreams come true, but they come true if you're persistent and resilient. And I think we have an example of the power of imagination here. Please thanks Janet.
Thank you, Janet.